Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Senator Schumer from New York says he's going to save the planet from global warming.
Global warming is upon us. When you get 2 record rainfalls in a week, it's not just coincidence. When you get all the changes that we have seen in weather, that's not a coincidence. Global warming is upon us, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse unless we do something about it. And that's why it's so imperative to pass the 2 bills, the infrastructure bill and the budget reconciliation bill. The second deals with climate change and will reduce the amount of carbon we put in the atmosphere by 50% by 2030.
Senator Schumer says he's going to save the climate by reducing carbon dioxide levels. Suppose he could bring carbon dioxide levels back to what they were on this date in 1935. On September 2nd, 1935, the most intense hurricane in U.S. history hit Florida. The winds were over 200 miles per hour and hundreds of people were killed in the storm. The winds were so strong that it blew this train in the Florida Keys 50 feet off the tracks. And a few weeks before the record hurricane in Florida, Texas set the world's record rainfall. On May 31, 1935, Woodward Ranch, Texas had 22 inches of rain in 2 hours and 45 minutes. This was world record rainfall, and it broke the previous world record, which was set a few hours earlier in Colorado. On May 30, 1935, 2 locations in Colorado received almost 23 inches of rain in 4 hours. This led to the deadliest floods on record in Nebraska. The rains this year weren't anywhere near as big as the ones in 1935, but Senator Schumer said if he got 2 record rains in 1 week, that was global warming. So apparently Colorado and Texas were victims of global warming almost 90 years ago. And a few weeks before the world's record rainfall in Texas in May 1935 came the worst dust storms on record. Perhaps instead of 1935, Senator Schumer wants us to go back to 1939. Most of the forest in Victoria, Australia burned on Black Friday in January 1939. Melbourne, Canberra, and Adelaide all set their all-time record temperature. There were lots of people screaming climate change in 1939, but the Des Moines Register said those changes in climate were imaginary, and they said this myth arises over and over again. 1935 and 1939 were pretty awful. What about 1936, when all of Eastern America was described as being under floodwaters? 100 cities in 14 states were flooded in the east while they were having huge dust storms in the west. And at the same time, our top politicians were making peace with Herr Hitler. This is what downtown Pittsburgh looked like on March 21, 1936. My grandfather was in a business meeting there and had to be evacuated by boat. The summer of 1936 went on to be by far the hottest on record in the United States, with thousands and thousands of people dying from the heat. 1936 was a pretty awful year with tornadoes, flooding, and heat, but 1937 had even worse floods. The worst flooding on record in the Ohio River Valley led to 950 miles of rivers being flooded. The flood extended all the way from eastern Ohio into Arkansas. 1937 was a pretty awful year, and 1938 brought the strongest hurricane on record to the northeastern United States. Hundreds of people died in the 1938 New England hurricane. This is what Peterborough, New Hampshire looked like. And this is what downtown Providence, Rhode Island looked like. Apparently Senator Schumer wants us to go back to the good old days of 1938. What about this date in 1954 when Hurricane Carol devastated New England? No major hurricanes have hit New England since 1954, but 2 of them hit New England within 12 days of each other during September 1954. And a few weeks later, the United States and Canada were devastated by Major Hurricane Hazel, which was the deadliest hurricane in Canada's history. 1954 was a pretty awful year. What about 100 years ago this week when millions of people were starving from the record heat and drought in Europe, Russia, and Asia? 1921 was one of the hottest years on record in the United States, and it also brought some of the worst flooding. 1,500 people died in a flood in Pueblo, Colorado during June of 1921. 1921 was pretty awful, but probably the worst week on record for weather in the United States was the end of March 1913. The country was devastated by huge tornadoes from coast to coast and massive flooding in the east. This is what upstate New York looked like in March 1913. And what about 1926, when Miami was destroyed by a major hurricane, which was the inflation-adjusted most expensive disaster in U.S. history? Miami Beach wasn't such a great vacation spot during September 1926. The weather was pretty awful in 1926, and scientists blamed the bad weather on gigantic spots on the sun. The following year, 1927, brought the worst flood on record to the United States when the Mississippi River was flooded for 6 months. Vermont also had their worst floods on record in 1927, which took out more than 1,000 bridges and drowned the lieutenant governor. St. Louis was largely destroyed by a tornado this month in 1927. The Red Cross said that floods and tornadoes made 1927 the worst disaster year in their history. And what about March of 1925, when the largest and deadliest tornado on record devastated at least 3 states in the Midwest? Perhaps Senator Schumer wants us to go back to 1911, when New England experienced their worst and deadliest heat wave. 1,500 people died in the heat, and at the same time 40,000 people died from the heat in Paris. This week in the year 1900 brought the deadliest hurricane on record to the United States. Galveston, Texas was destroyed by a Category 4 hurricane that killed 10,000 people. Another possibility for Senator Schumer is to time travel us back to 1896, when Southeast Australia had their worst heat wave on record, and the heat in New York City killed 1,500 people. Maybe he wants to go back 150 years ago to the autumn of 1871. On October 8, 1871, the United States had our worst forest fires on record, all around Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. Dozens of cities around the Great Lakes burned up that day, but the hardest hit was Peshtigo, Wisconsin, where more than 1,000 people died. And on that same day, 150 years ago, Chicago burned to the ground. 150 years ago was a pretty awful year for weather, but like in 1939, intelligent people understood that climate change was imaginary. The weather was always like this. Senator Schumer believes we're having a record high fire year, when in fact forest fire burn acreage in the United States is down 90% since the 1930s. This week in 1931, China was experiencing the deadliest floods on record. 50,000 square miles was flooded, 3 million drowned, and 30 million were left homeless and hungry. This is what 50,000 square miles of China looked like 90 years ago, so it's no surprise that millions of people drowned. At the same time, most of the United States was covered with drought, and people in many states were starving. There's been lots and lots of very bad weather in the past at much lower carbon dioxide levels, and I'm just scratching the surface here. I could go on like this for days. We don't have to guess what the climate was like at lower levels of CO2 because we have lots and lots of history showing us that the climate was pretty awful. Senator Schumer's beliefs are based on ignorance and superstition, not science. Over the past 30 years, politicians have been scamming the public with dozens of climate agreements which have had no impact on the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. While Western governments are shutting down their economies, China is building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants. Western countries have been very comfortable for a long time and have lost all sense of appreciation and perspective. And China is more than happy to take advantage of useful idiots like Senator Schumer. During the 16th century, people in Europe and America became convinced that the climate was getting worse and was being caused by witches cooking the weather. They burned tens of thousands of witches at the stake because they thought that would improve the weather. Now Senator Schumer wants to burn down our entire civilization. Climate alarmists imagine that they're very smart and sophisticated and they're following the science, but the reality is that they have no clue what they're doing. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this scam for the past 13 years. You can visit him, Curie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.